Hey everyone, Jonathan Sriranganathan here with another session of Reimagining the City. I'm the Greens candidate for Mayor of Brisbane in the 2024 council elections. I wanted to start by acknowledging country and paying respects to the Yagara and Turrbal peoples, the rightful owners of this land, recognising that sovereignty was never ceded and that when we're talking about the future of our city, we need to be mindful of our own complicity in colonisation and the responsibility that non-Indigenous settlers have to stand in solidarity with First Nations peoples. And that shouldn't just be an afterthought or something tokenistic. We need to sort of really centre it in our politics. But yeah, this week I'm joined for a discussion with Wendy Aghdam, our council candidate for Central Ward. Central Ward covers the city's sort of CBD and those inner northern suburbs like Spring Hill and New Farm. So I'm really excited to chat to Wendy about what's happening in her part of the city and what's important. Wendy, did you want to introduce yourself and tell us a bit about who you are and why you're running?
Sure. Well, I'm Wendy. I definitely didn't see myself here a while back, but I've been a nurse for nearly 18 years, so the better part of 2 decades, and worked in kind of disability care before that. So it's really just been about working with people and trying to listen to them and help them to, I guess, look at what's causing issues in their life and help them to solve it with a whole bunch of multidisciplinary workers. I've always loved my work. It's been really challenging, but it's been really great to see how these young people and their families can really thrive after a little bit of support. But I guess after years of working in emergency wards, hospital wards, schools, community centres, I really could see that the system was really working against whatever these families and young people were really trying to do to help themselves. They didn't feel connected to community. Parents just felt a lot of pressure that they really couldn't be there. One thing that really regularly came up is that parents just couldn't attend meetings for their children's wellbeing because they were just so busy with work and other pressures or moving house.
And that kind of drew you into sort of thinking about bigger picture policy stuff.
Totally.
Yeah.
And I've always been interested in progressive politics. And, first time I kind of handed out how to votes were like probably 12 years ago for the Greens, and really interested in their policy. The values just really aligned. And then just after a few people kind of nudging to be like, come on, like step forward. And local government just felt like a really good fit because I just love the local area and I want people to feel a part of it.
Yeah, cool. I think your journey feels a little similar to mine because I was also doing a lot of that frontline community work where you're working one-on-one with people. I did a bit of like youth work and community development work, and you just keep seeing the same problems emerging again and again. You're like, oh, there's a pattern here and I'm fixing the symptoms of this broken system, but I have no influence over the underlying causes. So I can totally see why you've come into this space. I think you live in Fortitude Valley, right? And you're probably one of the only council candidates who lives in an apartment as opposed to a freestanding house.
Yeah. And we moved there. My husband and I moved there like 8.5 years ago. And he just loves inner city living. He's from, the middle of Tehran, like the biggest city in Iran, and loved the fact that, you can be in an apartment, but actually most of your life is spent outside, in the parks with your friends. And so me being I grew up in the suburbs, but born in Brisbane. And so I was a little bit of a convert, but now that I'm there, I kind of had this idea, once we, maybe have kids or maybe you'll move out to the suburbs, but realize that that's really just kind of that's kind of social pressure and people tell you that that's what you should do. But we love inner city living. And so we've just been such a convert. We use the parks every day. We go outside and use the dog parks with our dog. And my 6-year-old just loves being in an apartment and telling her friends that she lives with, with 500 other people,
Yeah. And I think that's a really interesting, that is a bit of a difference between high density living and suburban living where so much more of your life happens in the public realm or in third spaces outside the home. Like, the fact that you might have a smaller private space, a smaller apartment, doesn't matter as much if you have that good access to public space. And that's the big if in Brisbane, because there are some areas that have really good access to public spaces and cafes and third spaces and whatnot. And then there are some parts of the city where there's lots of high density apartments, but not really many other places to hang out. And so you get these big towers with fairly sort of silent streetscapes because the council hasn't provided those other places for people to meet and gather. But yeah, what's coming up for you at the moment? Like, what are residents telling you is important? I know you've been out door knocking for a while now on the campaign. What's the vibe like?
It's been really great. Like, I've just loved knocking on a door, asking people what they want, and they honestly just say, oh, I've honestly never been asked what we want from council. And they don't think that council have a lot of power over some things. So when you really prompt them about what council might have the power to do, they've definitely come out with a lot of issues. They talk about the streets a lot. So I've been out in Spring Hill, New Farm a lot. They're saying that just the parking is horrible. They're used as a car park for the CBD. A lot of the parking restrictions aren't actually good for residents, but they're good for people just kind of coming into the area. The streets themselves aren't safe. So a lot of kind of either hilly or straight, wide streets that just kind of encourage speeding. Not through really any huge fault of like the driver, because that's just looks big and it looks safe for them to drive fast. But it just means that parents can't take their kids out.
Yeah, and I think that's a consistent problem in a lot of outer suburbia as well, but even our inner city suburbs that could be walkable neighbourhoods where streets feel more like usable public spaces are still so dominated by cars, because the sort of traditionally a lot of Brisbane roads and streets were like 12.5 metres wide from like gutter to gutter. So you've got like parking on both sides and then there's space for two cars to park each other in the middle. But that's quite a big, wide bitumen corridor that, as you say, cars can roar down. They feel like a bit of a racetrack sometimes. And then that has all these flow-on effects where like parents don't feel safe letting their kids play out in the front yard or on the front footpath because they're worried the kids will like chase a ball out onto the road and get hit by a car. And
when the roads are so wide and then the verges are so narrow, there's not a whole lot of space for those trees to be
big time
shading. There's some beautiful areas of New Farm where they do actually have bigger verge with bigger trees, and they're the streets that people really envy. Like I want to live there, and they're the streets I want to be on. But that could be definitely done a lot more around other streets.
And I think that's, one of the things that politicians or the council has to be willing to do sometimes is take away a little bit of street parking or narrow the road corridor to take a bit of space away from cars so that we have more room for wider footpaths and for proper street trees. Because I think a lot of people, particularly in the inner city, they will complain and say, look, the footpath's not wide enough, I can't pass someone else with my stroller or whatever. And they'll say there's not enough street trees, there's not enough shade. And that's all true. But then there's the question of, are residents willing to give up some of that street parking to make room for it? And I think sometimes what happens is that there are certain residents who are like, no, you definitely can't take any of the street parking. And they're quite vocal about that. And then the council misinterprets that as being everyone's view. So you sometimes end up with this vocal minority speaking up very strongly in defence of street parking, which means that the sort of silent majority of people who are like, actually, yeah, I would like more room for street trees or bike lanes or footpaths or just green verge gardens and places for people to meet and chat. Those people aren't heard as much. And so the council just sticks with this mentality of, we just have to keep all the street parking.
And I'm a huge, I guess language and communication is a big part of what I've done as part of my job. A psychiatrist might be able to explain a medication to a patient who then was like, actually, I need this in just plain language. And very much reframing things in positive terms. Like when we talk about streets, we're not talking about taking away parking. We're actually talking about what are we adding to this community.
Yeah, really good approach.
And when people know what the alternative is, the same with a lot of development has been a huge conversation topic at the door. People saying, look, thankfully, most people are saying, look, we do want some development. We know it has to happen, but it needs to be the right kind of development for our community. It can't just be something that's going to be this huge hotel that's just going to bring people that aren't actually adding a whole lot to the community.
And by that, you mean like short-term visitors who come and go?
Yes, correct. And by that, you need a whole lot more infrastructure to support that, but you're supporting the visitors.
Yeah, and I think this is a challenge with densification is that, as we said before, density needs public spaces and other community facilities like libraries and community centres. And so part of the problem we've had in places like Fortitude Valley, for example, and certainly in West End, is that a lot of high-density development has gone in, but there hasn't been a proportionate increase in green space. There hasn't been any significant increase in like libraries or public facilities. And even only recently, they finally put in a new high school in Fortitude Valley after years of pressure and advocacy, including from the Greens, but from a lot of other people. But yeah, there's this sort of, I think that turns people against new developments because they're not seeing the benefits that densification can bring. And I think one of the things the Greens have got to try to talk about is that, no, density can be good if we do it well and if the services and infrastructure are there to match. But of course, if you leave it all up to private developers, they just want to cram as many units onto the block, and they certainly don't want to contribute towards the cost of new parks and bike lanes and all the other stuff we need. Hey,
Yeah, that's Newstead and Tenerife, probably where that's mostly come up. There's been a whole lot of development. So Newstead, as you might know, is the fourth most densified area in the whole country.
Wow,
in the
right.
past few years.
Yeah.
And yet, people see this green space, but it's actually been eroded because it's not a public green space. It's owned by the developers. So slowly these high rises are going up, and there's not a whole lot of addition of infrastructure. There's traffic around there. There's the parks are being eroded. There is a site there that Stephen Bates, federal MP for Brisbane, has been petitioning on, and residents are really supportive of actually this riverside, front spot to actually be turned into something for the community rather than the proposal, which is just dense luxury apartments.
Yeah, and I mean that site in particular is I'm pretty sure it's quite flood prone as well, isn't
Yeah.
it? So it makes sense that the most flood prone land along the river is the stuff that should be turned back into green space or community facilities, or at least, some of it can be used for public space rather than just luxury apartments. But
And there is a community building on that site
Right.
that is not being used because now it's been sold and it's going to be demolished as part of that.
So sad,
The developer is saying that they'll be returning something to as a community site, but it's not firm.
Yeah, and this is my frustration with a lot of new development is often the developers will promise something or there'll be sort of vague allusions to something, but it's not like a hard and fast locked in requirement in the city plan. So like the city plan will say, you need to have this many car parks, or, you need to have this many fire escapes or whatever. But the sort of developer commitments to, we will have this many square meters of community space are always a bit vague, and they don't define, is community space non-profit space that anyone can use, or is it like, we rented out this out to a cafe and we've called it community space, but actually it's just another business. So yeah, it's really interesting navigating all those tensions. I wanted to come back though to what you touched on earlier about like car dependence and car dominance in some of these neighborhoods, because the other thing I'm struck by is that with the lack of, or when there's shortages of green space in a local area, we don't necessarily see that manifested in the local neighborhood. It's not like suddenly the parks feel super, super crowded. Sometimes they do, and some parks like New Farm Park get a lot of use. But actually shortages of green space often manifest as people just drive in longer distances to other places. So there'll be a lot of people who like live in the valley or live in New Farm or whatever, but they're driving in their car to the middle suburbs to go to like Wednesday night touch footy or to like play a soccer game on the weekend or whatever. So it's like the impact of not putting in enough green space locally actually just means more traffic congestion, because people who live in the inner city and should be able to walk and ride and catch public transport for the majority of their transport needs are still having to drive to access green space and community facilities further out. And then you get how like middle suburban residents who are feeling annoyed because the park they live near, which is supposed to be a quiet suburban park, is getting lots of traffic and lots of people driving there because people in the inner city don't have enough green space within walking distance. But yeah, anyway, I find that stuff really interesting because sometimes, particularly LNP councillors will say, well, Jonno, you say there's not enough parks, but I walked past the park the other day and it was empty. I'm like, yeah, well, that tiny little park wasn't big enough for a soccer game, or there was no basketball court or whatever. So of course it's not usable. And I think this is something you've talked a bit about. Hey, public spaces need to be usable.
And that's like, if you're looking at green space, people know kind of inherently that it's good for your well-being. But you look at any kind of literature and research, they say green space is actually really only beneficial to you if it's got kind of three things, which is proximity, and if it's going to be usable, and if it's actually going to be like enough green space for the population.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it's just kind of put there tokenistically.
Totally. Yeah.
And like I was speaking to a family not that long ago in New Farm that said, like they bought there knowing that it's got this large bit of green space, that they could use it, but they said, our kids are keen basketballers, which means we actually have to travel to Taringa for the local basketball comp.
Yeah.
They would love, something that's going to be a bit more multi-use and something that's more for kids. And that's a huge part of really what I want to do is youth engagement, whereas youth don't feel welcome in our public spaces.
Not at all.
Especially in the inner city.
Yeah, and there's a bit of literature around about designing cities for children and thinking about child-centered urban design, and how even, say, the way we plan playgrounds and stuff is like there's a designated park, and within that park there's a designated playground, and that's where the kids are. But the whole rest of the urban landscape is like hostile to children. So even the idea of children being able to get to the playground by themselves is, it's not safe for them to walk across the roads or whatever. But like there were a few times when, as a counsellor, I was trying to get swing sets or small climbable play equipment put in next to a bus stop, because parents would be like, well, this is on our walk-in route to school, and then sometimes we'll be waiting for the bus for 10 minutes. And it'd be so nice if while we're sitting there and the kids are getting impatient and waiting for the bus to come, that there's like some play equipment or something to interact with on the streetscape. Even like we've put in a few public xylophones or little musical instruments in a few spots, which have been cool. But the council was so resistant to that. They were like, no, playgrounds only go in designated parks of a certain size. You can't just put play equipment along the street. Whereas a lot of European cities, they are starting to look more at those pocket parks and saying, actually, a small play facility doesn't need to have a huge amount of space. You can put something in, even in the size of a car parking bay, and that still is like a local node on the journey, or as people are moving through a neighborhood, it's something that kids can interact with temporarily. It means that the walk from home to the shops or home to the train station or whatever is just that a little bit more interesting for children, so they don't mind tagging along with the parents on errands and stuff. Whereas, if the urban landscape is just a constant stress of, oh, mum and dad won't let go of my hand and everyone's really stressed about me running onto the road, that experience for the kid is different as well.
And it's like when you're building something like that, you're actually telling not just the kid but the parent that this is actually for them. Whereas kids will use anything as play equipment.
True. Yeah.
They'll jump on the fence as they walk along. They'll like jump in little potholes, and that's just becomes part of their play and part of their game. They're just really inventive and curious. But parents are telling their children, no, that's not safe, because the parents are getting the message it's not for them. Whereas if you actually build things that kind of say this is okay for your child to use, then that's okay.
Yeah.
And again, like you said, pocket parks are great because it's going to be that proximity. If you know that your child is, and you can only walk 5 minutes, that means you're much more likely to go there a whole lot more often. Rather than, if that's a 10-minute walk, it might not seem like much, but that's 20 or more minutes out of your day just to get there. And especially in a hilly part of Brisbane, that 10 minutes means that a parent's much more likely to be like, oh, actually, let's drive.
True.
So pocket parks are great, but it needs to be given that permission. I'm actually probably finding in our areas, kids feel catered for a little bit more than youth. That
like
older
teenagers.
adolescent. Adolescents in the inner city definitely feel like there's no spaces for them. They describe being in areas and they're just told to go away.
Yeah, right.
And that means that, teenagers themselves are on the kind of outskirts of society. That's just kind of anthropologically. They want to be on the outskirts. They need to find their tribe. They need to feel welcomed, initiated into society per se. But if they keep getting told go away, they're being very clearly told the message is you don't belong here and we don't want you. They're not being welcomed, and then they're not going to contribute to their society.
It makes me think, one of the things that I used to come into the Valley for when I was like growing up in West Chermside was like live music and this wanting to be connected to like youth culture. But of course, until you turn 18, you're not really welcome in those adult bar spaces, and there weren't many like all ages gigs venues, and the regulations around liquor licensing meant it just wasn't worth it for like bar operators to be like, oh, I'm going to try and make this an all ages space. So like there's this sort of intermediary period where you're like, you definitely don't feel like a kid anymore, and you can hang out at the basketball court or whatever for a few hours a day, but at some point you want to go out and connect with the wider world. But there are these adults only spaces that seem really cool, and you kind of have to sneak in or you're excluded.
And there's a whole lot of literature again on what's called like intergenerational spaces, which is I think why South Bank works quite well to a certain degree. Like I know residents really fought to have that area, but there's playground spaces, there's places for youth to just kind of hang out. There's places for adults, and then there's places like that older people feel safe. They're welcomed there, and because there's staff at South Bank, that's actually a place where you might not think that youth feel more welcomed in a place that there's actually places that people like lifeguards, security guards, but they inherently feel more safe because there's people there to look after you.
There you go. We're almost running out of time, but one of the other ideas I wanted to float is that I've in the past had a few people talk about New Farm Park and the fact that it's this giant park, but it's got cars driving in a circle all the way through it. And it's kind of funny that we've got this huge ring road that's basically just car parking. And even if you were to say take all the cars off the ring road and park them somewhere in a corner. That would be more space efficient. But it just seems to me like a little bit of a shame that you've got kids who want to learn to ride their bike or people who want to take a walk around this sort of big ring road. But there's all these cars pulling in and out and it doesn't feel super safe. And so I've noticed even parents, like they'll be having a picnic, but their kid wants to run around there and be like, no, don't go that way because that's the direction of the road. And
and it's interesting that the trees in New Farm Park are fenced off because they're seen as dangerous because they might have branches falling.
Oh my gosh.
But the actual road isn't fenced off to children.
That's so true. Yeah. So I don't know. It's something to think about long term. But
I mean, as you'd know, I think we've talked about it before that they tried to build, it was proposed to build kind of a through road so people could get through from one side of New Farm Park to the other and use Powerhouse, and that was very strongly objected to.
Yeah, and that was a terrible idea from the Liberals. It was really going to carve up the park and turn it into, a through corridor. So I'm glad that idea was knocked on the head. But it did sort of prompt more people to be like, oh yeah, why are there cars parking all through the middle of this park? Particularly when there's really good public transport close by and particularly when there's a fairly big population within walking distance. But I guess the thing about green politics is that we think these decisions should be made by communities, right? So it's not just up to you and me to make this sort of decision. It's like, we want to know what people out there in the world think. So if you're listening to this later on and you've got thoughts about this stuff, you can find Wendy's email online and flick her a message and let us know what you think about the future of the neighbourhood.
Yeah. And I've got such an open mind. I'm so happy to be proven wrong about my ideas. If I say, hey, I think this is a really great idea because of these reasons, but people might give me these rationales that are like, oh, yeah, actually, that's a really great idea. And if the majority of the community really agree with that as well, it is really about grassroots. It's about people determining. And again, there's so much research to show that when a community is involved in that co-design, when they feel like they've contributed to their design of their community and what it is, they're a whole lot more willing to look after it and be a part of it and then want to stay there and have stable housing. And that just means everyone feels happier and healthier.
Well said. This is a pretty good note to end on, I think. But I guess we're a little over 4 months away from Election Day. Do you want to just tell listeners really quickly what's the plan for the next few months? What's the campaign going to look like for you?
I think we're going to be starting to pivot now from, I guess, collating a whole lot of ideas from those conversations that we've had. We've now knocked on thousands of doors. We're having all those conversations where we've reached a whole lot of people in those door-knockable houses, but Central has a whole lot of apartments. So we want to try and reach those people as much as possible and then pivot from actually collating those ideas to then
being like, here's our position, or here's what you've told us, here's what we want to do with it. Yeah.
And
cool.
then talking to people about what they think, and then I guess then we'll be asking them to try and change that. I actually really think the fact that it's on March 16th is a really good omen because St. Patrick's Day is the day after.
Right.
So let's turn Brisbane green.
Yay. Cool. Well, good luck with the campaign, Wendy, and thanks for the chat.
No, thanks for inviting me, Jonno. Cool. Take care.
Thanks. Bye.